The most frightening truth for an avoidant is not that they lose someone. It is the realization that the person they pushed away was never unaware. They were simply patient enough to understand everything before deciding whether to leave. An avoidant often moves through relationships believing their patterns stay hidden. They assume the other person does not fully notice the emotional distance, the sudden closeness followed by withdrawal, the inconsistent communication, and the way intimacy is pulled back the moment it gets too real. In their mind, patience means the other person is confused, understanding means they are too forgiving, and kindness means they are blind to what is really happening. So they convince themselves their push and pull behavior is too subtle to be understood. They believe their disappearing acts, their return with charm, and their emotional detachment will be interpreted as confusion rather than a clear pattern. They think only they understand this cycle, but everything changes when they realize the truth. The other person was always fully aware. What shocks the avoidant is not just that their behavior was noticed, but that it was studied. The partner wasn't reacting blindly or emotionally. They were observing, quietly collecting moments, recognizing patterns, and slowly building a clear understanding of who the avoidant was showing up as in the relationship. This realization hits deeply because it removes the illusion of invisibility. Nothing was hidden. The distance, the inconsistency, the emotional shutdowns, the mixed signals, all of it was seen clearly. Not misunderstood, not excused, but fully recognized. The avoidant then understands something unsettling. The partner's calmness was not ignorance. Their patience was not weakness. Their silence was not acceptance of poor treatment. It was awareness combined with observation. They were waiting to see the full pattern before deciding what to do. And that is what changes everything. The avoidant begins to realize they were not dealing with someone confused, but someone careful. Someone who was watching without rushing, learning without reacting, and choosing not to respond until the truth became undeniable. This removes the avoidant's sense of control. What they thought was emotional power becomes exposure. What they thought was distance that kept them safe becomes evidence that was being collected all along. They start to see that every moment they pulled away after closeness, every time they went cold, every unclear promise, every emotional withdrawal was not just felt by the partner, but remembered. The partner was not guessing. They were documenting the pattern in real time through experience. This is where discomfort grows. The avoidant realizes they cannot hide behind inconsistency anymore. The belief that their behavior creates confusion collapses when they understand the other person was never confused. They were simply patient. And eventually, something even more difficult happens. The partner stops chasing. For an avoidant, this is often the breaking point. Because they are used to distance creating pursuit, they are used to withdrawal being followed by effort from the other person. But when the partner who once tried starts pulling back completely, the avoidant is left with the full impact of their own behavior. Now there is no chase, no over-explaining, no emotional pursuit to balance their distance. Just clarity. In that silence, the avoidant begins to replay everything. They remember moments where their partner stayed calm instead of reacting, where they observed instead of arguing, where they chose understanding over emotional chaos. Those moments now look different. They were not tolerance without awareness. They were awareness without immediate response. And this realization is what creates pressure inside the avoidant. Because they finally understand they were seen far more clearly than they ever expected. Every withdrawal was noticed. Every inconsistency was understood. Every emotional pattern was tracked. And nothing was accidental or missed. At this point, avoidance strategies stop working the same way. Distance no longer confuses. Silence no longer controls the narrative. Mixed signals no longer create emotional dependence. because the other person already sees the pattern clearly enough to no longer participate in it. This is where accountability enters, something avoidants usually avoid at all costs. Not because someone is attacking them, but because they are finally being understood without distortion. And when that happens, the emotional advantage disappears. What remains is recognition, discomfort, and the unsettling awareness of being fully seen by someone they assumed was not paying attention. This is the moment everything shifts, because once someone sees the truth clearly, they do not need to be convinced anymore. And that is what changes the entire dynamic. They begin to feel the weight of being truly understood, not in a comforting way, but in a way that removes every layer of protection they once relied on. It is an exposure they cannot easily escape, because it creates a new awareness inside them, a clearer understanding that their emotional patterns are no longer hidden or protected by misunderstanding. And for the first time, they may recognize something uncomfortable. The person they treated as emotionally fragile was not the fragile one in the connection. That realization changes something in them, even if they do not show it. For some avoidants, it becomes the beginning of reflection. They start to see how their fear of closeness created distance in moments where love could have been safe. But for others, the pressure of that awareness is too much, and they retreat even further into avoidance. Yet regardless of their reaction, one truth does not change. The partner saw everything. They understood everything. They remembered everything. And they stayed only until staying no longer aligned with their own emotional well-being. What the avoidant rarely prepares for is the moment that partner finally detaches completely. Because that is when a deeper truth lands inside them. Losing someone who genuinely saw their potential and still chose patience is far more painful than they expected. And that pain is not simply about abandonment. It comes from the recognition that their own behavior created the ending. That realization tends to stay with them. It becomes something they replay long after the relationship is over. Because it forces them to face the parts of themselves they spent a long time avoiding. What they once assumed was acceptance without awareness was never that at all. It was quiet observation, intentional, patient, and steady. The partner was not confused. They were not lost in emotion. They were watching carefully, allowing time to reveal patterns instead of reacting to isolated moments. What looked like tolerance was actually data collection, a slow understanding of emotional behavior over time, a private process of recognizing how the avoidant responded to closeness, stress, vulnerability, and connection. Their silence was never ignorance. It was restraint, a choice to observe rather than interrupt, because patterns reveal more truth than arguments ever could. And this is why the realization hits so deeply later. It forces the avoidant to understand they were never as unreadable as they believed. They were not mysterious. They were not hidden. They were visible all along. Every withdrawal, every emotional shutdown, every shift from warmth to distance was seen clearly. Not excused, not misunderstood, but recorded internally as part of a consistent pattern. The partner was not clinging out of desperation. They were not holding on blindly. They were assessing whether emotional consistency was ever going to exist in that connection. They were studying behavior, not chasing affection. And the avoidant only fully understands this when silence becomes final. When there is no more reaching, no more emotional pursuit, no more attempts to bridge the distance. Only clarity. In that absence, the realization sharpens. The partner was not waiting for change without awareness. They were waiting for evidence. And once the pattern became undeniable, they made their decision quietly, without drama, without emotional chaos, but with certainty. Not to punish, but to protect themselves. That is when patience reveals its true meaning. It was never weakness. It was never emotional dependence. It was observation with boundaries. A careful evaluation of emotional safety over time. Once that becomes clear, the avoidant sees something they never expected. Their partner was not hoping endlessly for change. They were measuring whether staying was still healthy for them. And when the answer became no, they left. What unsettles the avoidant most is the reversal of what they believed. They thought they were the ones controlling emotional distance. They thought inconsistency gave them power. They thought withdrawal kept them safe and unreadable. But in the end, every one of those behaviors became information. And that information shaped the partner's decision to step away. The final shock is realizing the person they assumed would stay no matter what was actually the one strong enough to leave. Not in confusion, not in emotional collapse, but in clarity. Their silence at the end was not uncertainty, it was understanding. Their distance was not fear, it was self-respect. And their departure was not reaction, it was conclusion. What the avoidant learns too late is that real strength was never in staying emotionally unavailable. It was in recognizing when love is no longer sustainable and choosing oneself without hesitation. And that is the truth that remains when everything else falls away. Sometimes silence is truth. And sometimes it is the clearest message a person can ever give without speaking a word. Over time, the avoidant begins to understand that what felt like stability in the relationship was actually something else entirely. It was the other person giving space, watching carefully, and allowing time to reveal whether change was possible. It was a quiet opportunity to show consistency, emotional responsibility, and real effort. But instead of stepping into that opportunity, the same patterns kept repeating, shutting down when things felt too close, pulling away when emotions became real, using distance as protection instead of connection. The avoidant often assumes these moments go unnoticed, especially the sudden coldness, the emotional dismissal, or the discomfort when vulnerability appears. But none of it was invisible. Everything was being understood, not through reaction, but through observation. Silence was not emptiness, it was awareness forming in real time. The avoidant eventually realizes that their partner was never asking for perfection. They were asking for participation. Not flawless emotional expression, just effort. Not full understanding, just honesty. Not constant certainty, just willingness to stay engaged. But what they experienced instead was inconsistency, emotional withdrawal, confusion disguised as independence. And over time, what the avoidant thought was self-protection actually communicated something very different to the other person. That emotional connection would always be one-sided. By the time this becomes clear, it is usually too late. Because when someone gathers enough emotional evidence that consistency is not possible, they stop arguing. They stop explaining. They stop trying to fix what is not being met halfway. They simply choose themselves and step away with clarity. No chaos, no desperation, just quiet decision. And in that decision, the avoidant finally understands something they missed the entire time. The person they assumed was unaware was never unaware. They were simply kind. And kindness is not blindness. It is patience with awareness. That kindness gave space for patterns to fully reveal themselves. And once those patterns became undeniable, the person who once stayed patiently made a clear and steady exit. What follows is a deeper realization for the avoidant. They begin to see that the calmness, patience, and emotional presence of their partner were not signs of weakness. They were signs of strength. Strength to observe without reacting. Strength to stay grounded while receiving inconsistency. Strength to understand before deciding. What once looked like someone too attached to leave was actually someone capable of leaving at the right time. Their partner was not staying because they couldn't go. They were staying because they were evaluating, watching behavior over time, distinguishing between momentary struggles and consistent emotional patterns, understanding whether growth was happening or whether the same cycle would continue. The avoidant starts to see that this patience had structure. It had limits. even if those limits were never spoken aloud. There was always an internal line being drawn quietly, based on emotional safety and long-term compatibility. And the moment that line was crossed, everything changed. What felt stable to the avoidant was actually a silent evaluation reaching its conclusion. The absence of arguments was not harmony, it was observation. The absence of conflict was not acceptance, it was assessment. When the partner finally walked away, it was not sudden. It was the result of everything they had been quietly learning all along. Another painful realization follows. The avoidant understands that silence was never agreement. It was never approval. It was never emotional surrender. It was space, given intentionally, to allow truth to appear without interference. The avoidant believed silence meant acceptance, but in reality, it meant the opposite. It meant the other person was watching closely enough to no longer need explanations. They were not trying to control the avoidant. They were not trying to fix them. They were simply allowing them to reveal themselves fully, so the truth would not be questioned later. And once that truth became clear, the decision was made without hesitation. Not out of anger, not out of emotional collapse, but out of understanding. This is the part that stays with the avoidant. The realization that they were not misunderstood. They were not mysterious. They were not unreadable. They were simply observed, understood, and eventually responded to with finality. And in that silence at the end, they finally recognize what they could not see before. That real emotional clarity does not always arrive with words. Sometimes it arrives when someone quietly decides they have seen enough. This creates a painful shock for the avoidant because they finally see that their partner was never blind, never dependent, and never naive. They were steady, observant, and far more grounded than they ever gave them credit for. They didn't feel the need to call out every mistake or turn every moment into confrontation. They didn't chase explanations, beg for consistency, or demand constant emotional change. Instead, they watched. Quietly, consistently, with awareness. They learned to tell the difference between emotional wounds and fixed behavior patterns. And what the avoidant once misread as silence or tolerance was actually something much deeper. That silence was intelligence. That patience was self-respect. That calm presence was emotional clarity. The avoidant starts to realize that their partner's lack of constant confrontation was not fear. It was strength. The strength to remain composed without abandoning themselves in the process. They had boundaries, standards, and a clear sense of self-worth that didn't need to be loudly announced in order to exist. Even while caring deeply, they never lost themselves inside the relationship. And that is something the avoidant completely underestimated. What once looked like emotional dependence was actually emotional independence. What seemed like quiet acceptance was actually careful observation. And what the avoidant interpreted as weakness was, in reality, control. Their partner knew how to choose love consciously, not blindly. They waited for behavior, not promises. They responded to consistency, not potential. And they understood something the avoidant did not expect. They could leave the moment the emotional balance no longer made sense. That realization cuts through the avoidant's defenses in a way they can't easily ignore. They begin to see how often they confused calmness with fragility and patience with lack of awareness. But none of that was true. Their partner wasn't staying because they couldn't leave. They were staying because they were still gathering clarity. And when clarity arrived, they left without hesitation. Looking back, the avoidant starts to understand that having someone willing to stay through confusion, distance, and emotional inconsistency was not something ordinary. It was something valuable, something they didn't recognize until it was already gone. Every silent moment now carries a different meaning. Every calm response was not passive acceptance, but quiet evaluation. Every soft reaction was not avoidance of truth, but restraint guided by awareness. What felt like forgiveness was actually observation. What felt like patience without limits was actually patience with structure. And the most unsettling realization is that their partner was always mirroring the relationship back to them without distortion. Not through arguments, but through steady presence and careful attention. The avoidant begins to see how wrong their interpretation was. They mistook emotional intelligence for naivety. They mistook kindness for weakness. They mistook patience for fear. But their partner was none of those things. They were clear. They were intentional. And they were paying attention to everything. Over time, the partner begins to see a repeating emotional pattern in the relationship. It is no longer just about isolated moments or temporary misunderstandings. It becomes something consistent and recognizable. They notice a cycle that keeps repeating itself. When closeness starts to build, it is often followed by distance. When emotional connection deepens, it is met with withdrawal. When effort is given, it is not matched with stability, but followed by emotional shutdown or pulling away. At first, this could have been explained away as stress, fear, timing, or emotional difficulty. But over time, those explanations stop fitting the reality. The same pattern keeps happening again and again in slightly different forms, but with the same emotional result. This is where their understanding shifts. They stop seeing it as random behavior and start seeing it as a pattern. And once something becomes a pattern, it is no longer confusing. It becomes information. They begin to understand that this is not a temporary phase the avoidant is going through. It is not something that will naturally disappear with time or more patience. It is a consistent way of responding to emotional closeness. And that consistency is what defines it. From that point, their mindset changes. They are no longer reacting emotionally to each individual situation. They are observing the overall structure of the relationship. They are looking at the full picture instead of isolated moments. So when they see closeness followed by withdrawal again and again, they no longer interpret it as something accidental. They interpret it as a pattern of emotional availability and emotional avoidance coexisting in a cycle that does not resolve itself. And once that understanding becomes clear enough, the emotional confusion disappears. What remains is clarity. That clarity leads to a difficult but grounded realization. Staying in a relationship where emotional consistency does not exist will not lead to stability. No matter how much understanding, patience, or effort is given, the pattern itself is not changing. At that point, the decision to leave is no longer driven by emotion in the moment. It is driven by accumulated understanding. It is not a reaction to a single incident. It is the conclusion of many incidents over time. The avoidant, looking back, begins to misunderstand this process at first. From their perspective, the departure may seem sudden or emotionally charged. But from the partner's perspective, it is the opposite. It is not sudden at all. The decision to leave was forming quietly long before the actual separation happened. Every moment of withdrawal, every emotional shutdown, every broken sense of connection was not forgotten. It was stored mentally as part of a larger pattern that was being recognized over time. Nothing about the ending was based on one moment. It was based on many moments that all pointed in the same direction. So when the partner finally leaves, it is not because they are overwhelmed in that exact moment. It is because they have already reached clarity. The emotional processing has already happened internally, long before the exit. By the time they walk away, they are no longer questioning what is happening. They already understand it fully. That is why the final decision feels calm rather than chaotic. It is not fueled by confusion or emotional instability. It is grounded in recognition. Recognition that consistency is missing, and without consistency, emotional connection cannot remain healthy or sustainable. The avoidant later comes to realize something important through this ending. The relationship did not fall apart suddenly. It did not collapse without warning. It did not end because of one mistake or one argument. It ended because a pattern that never changed eventually became impossible to continue accepting. And this realization is what creates the emotional impact for the avoidant. Because they understand that the ending was not unpredictable or random, it was the natural result of everything that had already been seen, felt, and understood by the other person. The final moment of leaving, which the avoidant may have experienced as surprising or unexpected, was actually the last step in a long internal process of clarity. So when the partner walked away, it was not confusion guiding them, it was certainty. And that certainty came from time, observation, and the undeniable truth that emotional consistency was never going to appear on its own.